Imagine you're 78 years old, and you've just poured yourself a cup of coffee in your daughter's kitchen on a quiet Sunday morning. The house smells like maple syrup and printer ink. You walk past the home office to grab the newspaper, and that's when you see it. A stack of papers sitting on the counter, half hidden under a grocery list. Your name is at the top. There's a date. There's a signature line. And it's already been filled in with your name, in your daughter's handwriting, practicing what your own signature is supposed to look like. You don't say anything. You just stand there in your socks, holding a mug that's getting cold in your hands, staring at a document that has already decided how the rest of your life is going to go. That's how it started for me. Not with a diagnosis, not with a fall, not with some dramatic health scare in an emergency room. It started with paperwork on a kitchen counter, catching the morning light, telling me that my daughter had already made peace with putting me somewhere I had never agreed to go. Before we continue, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and let us know in the comments which country you're watching from. My name is Frank Sullivan. I'm 78 years old. For 34 years, I was a firefighter in Buffalo, New York. The kind of job where you run into buildings other people are running out of. I raised 2 kids in a house with a leaky roof. I fixed myself 3 separate times. I buried my wife, Eleanor, 4 years ago after 41 years of marriage. And 2 days after I found that contract on my daughter's kitchen counter, I was on a plane to Manila in the Philippines, with 1 suitcase and no plan. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this really begins. Not in that kitchen, but months earlier, in a house on Delaware Avenue that had gotten too quiet. After Eleanor passed, the house didn't feel like a home anymore. It felt like a museum. Her reading glasses were still on the nightstand for almost a year because I couldn't bring myself to move them. Her side of the closet stayed full. I'd walk past our wedding photo in the hallway probably 15 times a day, and some mornings I'd stop and just look at it, like maybe if I stared long enough, she'd blink. I'd spent my whole working life running toward emergencies, house fires, car wrecks, the occasional cat stuck somewhere it shouldn't have been. I was good in a crisis. I knew what to do when things were burning down. Nobody trains you for the quiet kind of collapse, though. Nobody teaches you what to do when the person who made your house a home is gone, and what's left is just rooms. My daughter, Patricia, we call her Patty, lived about 20 minutes away with her husband Doug and their 2 teenagers. My son Mike was out in Colorado, married with kids of his own, a good 2,000 miles away. Patty started checking in on me more after Eleanor died. At first it was sweet. She'd bring over casseroles I didn't ask for, sit with me on Sunday afternoons, ask if I was eating enough vegetables. I appreciated it. I really did. But somewhere along the way, checking in turned into checking up. And checking up turned into decisions being made about me instead of with me. It started small. She started coming by unannounced, going through my medicine cabinet, reorganizing my kitchen. So it's safer, as she put it. She'd ask me the same 3 questions every visit. What day is it? Who's the president? Can you tell me your address? Like she was quizzing a suspect. I understood where it came from. I wasn't blind to that. She'd lost her mother, and now she was terrified of losing her father, too. One small, forgotten detail at a time. But there's a difference between someone worrying about you and someone deciding for you. And I didn't see that line get crossed until it was already far behind me. Here's the thing nobody tells you about getting older in this country. It isn't the big losses that get you first. It's not a stroke, not a broken hip, not some sudden collapse. It's smaller than that. It's your kids starting to finish your sentences for you at restaurants. It's a doctor talking to your daughter about your test results instead of to you, like you're a car being discussed by 2 mechanics while it sits silently on the lift. It's people starting to speak a little louder and a little slower when they talk to you, even though your hearing's perfectly fine. It's your relevance they think is going deaf. I'd sit at Thanksgiving and watch my grandkids scroll through their phones, and I'd watch Patty and Doug talk about options for me in low voices in the kitchen when they thought I couldn't hear them from the living room. I could hear them just fine. 34 years of listening for cracking timber and shifting rubble will do that to your ears. You learn to catch things that are meant to be missed. I started feeling like a problem to be solved instead of a father to be visited. There was a particular Tuesday. I remember it was a Tuesday because Tuesdays were bingo down at the senior center, which I'd started going to more out of boredom than any real love for bingo. when Patty called and said she wanted to come by to talk about some things. That phrase alone should have told me everything. Nobody says, "I want to come by to talk about some things," when the things are good. She sat across from me at my own kitchen table, the one Eleanor and I bought secondhand in 1987 and never replaced because we liked the story of it, and she started talking about options for the next chapter. She'd brought brochures, actual glossy brochures, like she was selling me a vacation package instead of easing me out of my own life. Sunset Meadows, The Gables at Autumn Ridge, names designed by people who understood that nobody wants to say the word nursing home out loud, so they dress it up in the language of golf resorts. I told her I wasn't interested. I told her I was fine. I told her that I still mowed my own lawn, still drove myself to the grocery store, still cooked my own meals. Badly, sure, but I cooked them. She smiled the way you smile at someone you've already decided is wrong, and she said, "Just think about it, Dad. That's all I'm asking." But that wasn't all she was asking. That was never all she was asking. I just didn't know it yet. Weeks went by. The brochures disappeared from the kitchen table. I assumed because I'd made my feelings clear, and I thought maybe that was the end of it. I went on living my quiet life. Coffee at 6, newspaper on the porch if the weather allowed. A walk around the block, slower than it used to be, sure, but still my own 2 legs carrying me. Dinner alone most nights with the television on for company more than entertainment. Bed by 9. It wasn't the life I'd imagined for myself at 78. I'd imagined growing old with Eleanor, the 2 of us bickering pleasantly about whose turn it was to walk the dog we never actually got around to getting. I'd imagined trips we kept saying we'd take when things settled down, except things never settled down, and now she was gone and the trips were gone with her. But it was my life. It was quiet, and it was lonely, and some days it ached in a way that had nothing to do with my knees. But it was mine. That's what I didn't understand people were trying to take from me. Not comfort, not safety, ownership. The simple, basic right to decide what happens to the rest of my own days. I want to be fair here, because hindsight makes villains out of people who were only ever scared. Patty wasn't cruel. She wasn't trying to hurt me. She'd lost her mother, and in her mind, losing me too, even slowly, even just to some fall in the bathroom or a stove left on weekend, was a wound she didn't think she could survive twice. Fear does strange things to good people. It makes them start making decisions in secret, telling themselves it's for your own good, telling themselves that if they just handle everything quietly enough, you'll never even have to feel the loss of control. That's the cruelest kindness there is, the kind that takes your life away from you gently, so gently you don't even notice the theft, until it's already complete. I found out how far along it was on a Sunday in March. I'd gone to Patty's for what I thought was a regular visit. Doug was grilling despite the cold. The grandkids were half paying attention to us between video game sessions, and it felt, for a couple of hours, like an ordinary family Sunday. I went inside to refill my coffee and give the dog some water, and that's when I saw the folder on the kitchen counter, half buried under the mail. I wasn't snooping. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't the type of man who went through other people's things. But my name was right there, in bold black letters on a manila folder tab. Sullivan, Francis, intake. I opened it. I know I shouldn't have, maybe by some rule of politeness. But it was my name. It was my life. I had every right in the world to open a folder with my own name on it. Inside was a full application for a place called Brightview Senior Living. Financial disclosures, medical history forms, partially filled in with information Patty must have pulled from my medicine cabinet and old doctor's letters. And there, at the very back, a signature page. My name, signed. Except I hadn't signed it. It was Patty's handwriting, practicing my signature. Trial after trial after trial of Francis T. Sullivan, each attempt slightly different, like a teenager forging a hall pass, except this wasn't a hall pass. This was permission to move me out of my own home and into a building where somebody else would decide what time I ate breakfast. There was a date circled on a cover letter. 9 days away. I stood there in that kitchen holding a folder with my whole future forged inside it, and something happened to me that I hadn't felt in years. Not sadness, not even anger exactly, though there was plenty of that too, boiling somewhere under my ribs. What I felt was smaller and colder than anger, I felt erased, like somewhere in the last few months without a single conversation, without a single moment where anyone had actually asked me what I wanted, I had already been decided upon. My life had been discussed and settled the way you'd discuss and settle what to do with an old car that started needing too many repairs. Nobody had asked me. That was the thing that cut deepest. Not the home itself. Some of those places, I'm sure, are lovely, full of good people doing good work. It was that a decision this large, this final, about my body, my time, my last years on this earth, had been made in rooms I wasn't in voices lowered so I wouldn't hear, on forms signed in a hand that was practicing to be mine. I put the folder back exactly where I found it. I finished my coffee. I said goodbye to my grandkids, hugged my daughter, told Doug the burgers were good even though they were a little overdone, and I drove home in silence with the radio off because I needed to hear myself think. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my recliner, the one Eleanor always said was going to swallow me whole one day, and I stared at the ceiling and asked myself the only question that mattered. Was I actually done? Was this actually who I was now? A folder, a signature waiting to be forged, a problem waiting to be relocated? I thought about the fires I'd run into. I thought about the time I carried a 240-pound man down 4 flights of stairs on my shoulder because the elevator was out and the smoke was too thick to wait for a second team. I thought about the fear in every one of those buildings and how none of it, not one single fire in 34 years, had ever made me feel as powerless as that folder on my daughter's kitchen counter. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, sitting in that recliner with the television murmuring some rerun I wasn't watching, I remembered something. A few years back, maybe 18 months after Eleanor passed, a buddy of mine from the firehouse, Ray Whitfield, had mentioned that he was thinking about retiring somewhere overseas, somewhere his pension would stretch further, somewhere the weather wouldn't try to kill him every winter with ice on the front steps. He'd mentioned the Philippines specifically. I remembered laughing it off at the time. Ray, you can barely order Chinese food without pointing at the menu. How are you going to move to Asia? And thinking no more of it. But at 3 in the morning, with my future forged in another woman's handwriting sitting in a folder 20 minutes away, that memory didn't feel like a joke anymore. It felt like a door I hadn't noticed was open. I got up. I turned on my ancient desktop computer, the one Patty had bought me for my 70th birthday, that I mostly used for email and solitaire, and I typed into the search bar, "Retire Philippines cost of living." I don't know what I expected to find. Some scam, maybe. Some fantasy dressed up for people desperate enough to believe it. Instead, I found forum after forum, blog after blog, of men and women my age, Americans mostly, some British, some Australian, who had done exactly what I was suddenly, wildly considering. People living on their Social Security checks in beachside condos. People with full-time caregivers for less than what 1 week at Brightview Senior Living would have cost. People who talked about warmth, not just the weather, though God knows Buffalo winters had never been kind to my joints, but a different kind of warmth. The way strangers treated elders there. The way age wasn't something to be quietly managed and hidden. It was something respected. I read until the sun came up. I made a pot of coffee I didn't finish. And somewhere in there, between one blog post about a widower in Dumaguete and a forum thread about visa requirements, I made the decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to wait around to be moved into Brightview Senior Living. I wasn't going to let my last chapter be written in someone else's handwriting. I was going to leave. Not run away, I want to be clear about that, because at first that's what it felt like even to me, like I was some teenager sneaking out a window. But the more I sat with it, the more I understood it wasn't running away from anything. It was running toward something, toward a life I still had a say in, toward a version of my remaining years that belonged to me and nobody else. 2 days. That's how long it took from the moment I found that folder to the moment I was on a plane. I know that sounds impulsive for a man my age, and maybe it was, but I'd spent 34 years making split-second decisions with other people's lives on the line, and I trusted my gut more than most people trust a 5-year plan. My gut told me that if I gave this thing time to breathe, if I let myself sit in doubt for even a week, someone would talk me out of it. Someone would remind me of my knees, my age, my safety, and I would fold, the way I'd been folding quietly for months without even noticing, so I didn't tell anyone. I know how that sounds. But I'd learned something important in that folder, that when people love you and fear for you in equal measure, they stop asking you questions and start making decisions for you. I wasn't going to give anyone the chance to do that to me again. The next morning I called my nephew, a car salesman 2 towns over, and told him I wanted to sell my truck. The one I'd owned for 11 years. The one Eleanor used to tease me about because I refused to trade it in, even after the check engine light became a permanent fixture on the dashboard. He gave me a fair price cash, same day. I called a travel agent, an actual human being, because I didn't trust myself to navigate airline websites at 3 in the morning without messing something up, and booked a one-way flight to Manila for 2 days later. I packed 1 suitcase, some clothes, Eleanor's wedding ring, which I always carried in my breast pocket, close to my heart, wherever I went, a few photographs, my firefighter badge, retired but never thrown away, and that was it. 78 years of living, folded down into 1 suitcase and a carry-on. I want to tell you about the letter because I know you're wondering about it. I know the not knowing is sitting with you the same way it sat with my daughter when she got home from work that Tuesday and found my house empty. I didn't want to leave without a word. I wasn't trying to punish anybody, and I certainly wasn't trying to disappear into the ether without a trace, the way some men do when they can't face a hard conversation. I loved my daughter. I love her still, more than these words can carry. But I needed her to understand something that I couldn't say to her face, because if I said it to her face, she would have talked me out of it, the way loving people do when they're scared. So I wrote her a letter and left it on the kitchen table, my kitchen table, the same second-hand table Eleanor and I bought in 1987, the same table where Patty had once laid out brochures for places with names like golf resorts. I told her I loved her. I told her I understood why she'd done what she'd done, that fear makes people do things out of love that don't feel like love when you're on the receiving end. I told her I wasn't running from her, or from my grandchildren, or from the life I'd built in Buffalo. I told her I was running toward something I couldn't yet name, but that I needed, the way a man needs air. And I ended the letter with the one line I want you to remember, because it's the whole reason I'm telling you this story at all. I haven't finished living yet. 6 words. That's all it took to explain 78 years of a man deciding, for maybe the first time since his wife died, that his life still belonged to him. Manila hit me like a wall of warm, wet air the second the plane doors opened. A heat that didn't feel hostile the way summers back home sometimes did, but thick, alive, almost welcoming in its intensity. I remember standing at the top of those jet bridge stairs, because at that particular gate, they still walked you down onto the tarmac, and thinking, at 78 years old, with bad knees and a suitcase and no plan beyond a hotel reservation for 4 nights, Frank, you have officially lost your mind. But I want to tell you what I felt underneath that fear, because it surprised me. Underneath the fear was something I hadn't felt in years. Excitement. Actual bone-deep excitement. The kind I remembered from being 22 years old and taking the firefighter's exam, not knowing if I'd pass, not knowing what my life would become, just knowing that something enormous and unknown was in front of me and I was walking straight into it. The airport was loud and chaotic in a way that felt almost musical after the sterile quiet of American airports. Vendors calling out, families embracing arriving relatives with a kind of open emotional display that Americans, myself included, tend to save for weddings and funerals. Nobody looked at me twice for being an old man traveling alone. Nobody offered me a wheelchair I hadn't asked for, or spoke to me slowly like my age had somehow dulled my ability to understand English, which, considering it was my first language, would have been a fairly strange assumption anyway. A young man named Ronnie, who ran a small transport service I'd found through one of those retirement forums, picked me up at the airport with a sign that just said, Mr. Sullivan in marker. He helped with my bags without being asked, chatted with me the whole ride into the city about my flight, about America, about his own grandfather, who apparently still worked part-time at 76, and would have found it insulting to be told to stop. I remember thinking, somewhere in that car ride through traffic that made Buffalo rush hour look like a quiet country road, that I already felt more like a person and less like a problem than I had in the last 2 years combined. I won't pretend the first few weeks were easy. They weren't. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being somewhere completely unfamiliar, where you don't know the customs, don't know the language beyond a few phrases you practiced on the plane, don't know a single soul within 8,000 miles of where you're standing. The traffic terrified me. Buffalo traffic was nothing compared to Manila's, and my firefighter instincts, the ones that had once helped me stay calm inside a burning building, were useless against a jeepney merging into 3 lanes at once with what appeared to be no regard for the concept of lanes at all. I got lost more times in my first month than I had in my entire previous life combined, including that one time I got turned around in a Cleveland parking garage for 45 minutes back in 1994. The food was unfamiliar in ways both wonderful and occasionally alarming. I remember my first taste of balut, a delicacy I'd read about but nothing had quite prepared me for, offered to me by a neighbor with such genuine pride and generosity that I ate it despite every instinct telling me to run. I didn't love it, if I'm being honest, but I loved that he'd offered it, that sharing food with the elderly foreigner down the street was simply what you did. There were harder moments, too. I got sick that first month, some combination of unfamiliar food and the general exhaustion of uprooting my entire life at 78 Gi, and I spent 3 days in a small rented room with a fever, completely alone with nobody checking in on me because nobody knew to check. That was the first time doubt crept in. That was the first time I lay in a bed 8,000 miles from my daughter and thought, "What have you done, old man? What have you done?" I thought about calling Patty. I thought about admitting I'd made a terrible mistake, booking the first flight home, crawling back into the safe, managed life she'd been trying to build for me. Some part of me, the tired, feverish, homesick part, wanted exactly that. But another part of me, quieter but somehow stronger, reminded me of that folder, reminded me of the forged signature, reminded me that whatever discomfort I was feeling now, it was mine. It was a discomfort I had chosen, in service of a life I had chosen, and that made all the difference in the world compared to a comfort someone else had decided on for me. I got better. I found a doctor, a kind woman named Dr. Reyes who ran a small clinic 2 blocks from my rented room, who treated me not as a fragile old foreigner but as a patient, a person, who happened to have a fever and needed antibiotics. She asked me questions. She waited for my answers. Nobody in that room finished my sentences for me. Little by little, the unfamiliar started becoming familiar. I learned to navigate my neighborhood in Dumaguete. I'd relocated there after those first difficult weeks in Manila, drawn by the stories I'd read of a quieter, more manageable city by the sea, one popular with retirees precisely because it offered a gentler pace of life. I learned enough Bisaya to order my breakfast, to greet my neighbors, to haggle, gently, respectfully, at the local market, which the vendors seemed to find endlessly entertaining, this old white American trying so earnestly to negotiate for mangoes. I made a friend named Teodoro, Teddy, he insisted I call him, a retired school teacher about my age who spoke excellent English and had appointed himself, without ever discussing it explicitly, as my unofficial guide to actually living in the Philippines rather than just visiting it. We'd sit on his porch some evenings with cheap San Miguel beer, watching the sun go down over water that never once tried to freeze my car door shut. And he'd tell me stories about his own life, his own losses. He'd lost his wife, too. 4 years before mine had passed, which gave us a particular kind of understanding that didn't need many words. "You did a brave thing," he told me once, maybe 2 months in, after I'd finally told him the whole story, the folder, the forged signature, the letter on the kitchen table. "Most men your age, they let their children decide. They think it's respect. It's not respect, it's surrender. I found a rhythm. Mornings on my small balcony with coffee, watching fishing boats head out before dawn. Afternoons at the market or walking along the coast, my knees complaining less than they had in Buffalo winters. Strangely enough, something about the warmth seemed to be good for old bones. Evenings with Teddy or with a small circle of expats I'd slowly gathered, a retired nurse from Ohio, a widowed school teacher from Manchester, a former engineer from Toronto who'd been living there for 9 years and swore he'd never go back. I started volunteering, a few mornings a week, at a small community center that helped local children with their English lessons. Nobody had asked me to do this. Nobody had scheduled it for my enrichment, the way an activities director at Brightview Senior Living might have scheduled a supervised craft session. I chose it. I walked in one day, offered my help, and a woman named Marisol looked me up and down, this old American man in a faded polo shirt, and said, "Can you actually teach, or you just want to feel useful?" I laughed. I told her both, probably, and she put me to work that same afternoon. Those mornings became the anchor of my week. Watching a 9-year-old boy named Jomar slowly untangle the mystery of English past tense verbs did something for me that 34 years of firefighting commendations never quite had. It reminded me that I still had something to give, and that somebody somewhere still wanted it. About 4 months after I left, I finally called Patty. I want to be honest, I'd been putting it off. Part guilt, part fear of what I'd hear on the other end. I imagined anger. I imagined her crying, telling me I'd abandoned her, that I'd humiliated her by running away instead of talking to her like an adult. I imagined, worst of all, that she wouldn't answer at all. She answered on the second ring. There was a long silence after I said hello, long enough that I thought the call had dropped, and then she started crying, but not the way I'd braced for. She told me she'd read my letter probably 200 times. She told me that after the initial shock, after the anger, after 2 weeks of barely sleeping because she didn't know if I was safe, alive, lost somewhere on the other side of the world, she'd started to understand what I'd been trying to tell her. She told me about the folder, about how it had started as one small thing, a brochure her friend at work had recommended, just to have on hand, and how it had quietly snowballed into a full application, a forged signature, a plan made entirely without me, because somewhere along the way she and Doug had started talking about me instead of to me, the way you might discuss furniture that needs replacing. "I was so scared of losing you the way I lost Mom," she said, her voice cracking in a way that broke something loose in my own chest. "I thought if I just handled everything, if I just made it safe, I wouldn't have to feel that fear every single day." "You didn't lose me," I told her. "You almost lost me to a building with a nice name and a locked memory care wing. But you didn't lose me to the ocean, or the Philippines, or old age. I'm right here. I'm just here, instead of there." We talked for almost 2 hours that night. I told her about Teddy, about the community center, about Jomar and his past tense verbs, about the market vendors who now waved to me by name, about a life that, 4 months earlier, I hadn't even known existed, that I had built entirely on my own terms, out of nothing but a stolen folder and a 3 a.m. Google search. By the end of the call, she wasn't asking me to come home anymore. She was asking when she could visit. She did visit eventually. About 8 months after I'd left, she and Doug and the kids came for what was supposed to be a week and turned into 10 days, because none of them wanted to leave once they got there. She met Teddy. She sat in on one of my English lessons at the community center and watched me correct Jomar's grammar, with the same patience I'd apparently forgotten I still had. She watched me haggle for mangoes at the market badly and laugh about it afterward with vendors who clearly liked me despite my terrible negotiating skills. On her last night there, we sat on my little balcony with cheap beer, the same way I used to sit with Teddy, watching the sun go down over water that never once tried to kill me with black ice. "I get it now," she said. "I still don't love that you didn't tell me. I don't think I'll ever completely get over that part, but I get why you did it. And Dad, I'm sorry. I'm sorry we tried to decide this for you instead of asking you what you wanted." I told her there was nothing to forgive. Not really. That fear makes people do strange things when they love somebody. And that I understood that better than most, having spent 34 years running into burning buildings out of exactly that same kind of fear-driven love, just aimed at strangers instead of family. I'm writing this now from that same little balcony. Almost 2 years after that morning, I found a folder with my name on it. I'm 80 years old this year. My knees still complain some mornings, though less than they used to in Buffalo winters. Teddy and I still drink cheap beer most evenings. Jomar, now 11, reads better than most kids twice his age, and he still calls me Teacher Frank, with a kind of pride that does something to my chest every single time. I think about that folder sometimes, about the forged signature, about the version of my life that was almost decided for me by people who loved me, but had forgotten to ask me what I wanted. I don't blame my daughter anymore. I understand now that most of us, when we get old, become something to be managed instead of someone to be consulted. Not out of cruelty,